All right, attention. Captain to crew. All hands square away to decelerate. Ship's beeper will, as usual, sound 10 times after lights dim. Come on, Doc. DC, bosun.
Aye, aye, sir. DC stations. On the double.
There are films that entertain, and then there are films that permanently alter the landscape of an entire art form. Forbidden Planet, released in 1956 by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, belongs firmly in the second category. But while much has been written about its groundbreaking sets, its electronic soundtrack, and its philosophical ambitions, surprisingly little attention has been paid to the human beings who brought it to life. The cast of Forbidden Planet was not assembled by accident. Each performer carried a history, a personality, and a set of experiences that shaped the film in ways most audiences never realized. Some were established stars navigating unexpected career turns. Others were relative newcomers, whose work here would define how they were remembered for the rest of their lives. A few carried secrets and stories that never made it into any press kit or studio biography. What follows are 20 facts about the cast of Forbidden Planet that most fans have never encountered, drawn from production histories, personal memoirs, and the documented record of one of Hollywood's most remarkable productions. Number 20. The casting of Walter Pidgeon as the brooding, intellectually formidable Dr. Edward Morbius is so perfectly matched that it is difficult to imagine anyone else inhabiting the role. Yet Pidgeon was not the first name MGM considered when the project began taking shape. The studio initially circled several other established dramatic actors before settling on Pidgeon, whose reputation for playing men of authority and quiet intensity made him an eventual consensus choice. Pidgeon himself was at a transitional point in his career by the mid-1950s. The roles that had defined his peak years at MGM, including his celebrated wartime collaborations with Greer Garson in films like Mrs. Miniver and Madame Curie, belonged to a previous decade. Science fiction was considered below the prestige level he had occupied, and there were genuine internal discussions about whether a performer of his stature would accept the assignment. He did, and the decision transformed both the film and the final years of his screen career. Number 19. Anne Francis, who played Altera Morbius, the only woman on an alien planet surrounded by a crew of Earth spacemen, was 24 years old when Forbidden Planet went into production. She was already an established presence in Hollywood, having worked steadily in film and early television since her teenage years. The role of Altera presented challenges that went beyond the usual demands of acting. Francis later spoke in interviews about her discomfort with certain aspects of how the character was written and presented, particularly the emphasis placed on Altera's naivety about male attention and her function as the sole romantic focus of the film. She brought a self-possession to the performance that softened some of those edges, giving Altera a curiosity and intelligence that lifted the character beyond the purely decorative function she might have served in lesser hands. Francis's instincts were correct. Altera remains one of the more memorable female characters in 1950s science fiction precisely because of the dignity Francis brought to her. Number 18. Before Forbidden Planet made him recognizable to a wide cinema audience, Leslie Nielsen had built his craft almost entirely in the demanding world of live television drama. In the early 1950s, American television broadcast dramatic productions in real time, with no opportunity for retakes and no safety net of editing. Performers who worked in this environment developed a particular kind of discipline, precise acting that translated directly to film. Nielsen had appeared in dozens of these live productions before being cast as Commander John J. Adams, the steady, capable leader of the C-57D crew. The confidence he projects throughout the film, the sense of a man who processes extraordinary situations with professional calm, was not simply a character choice. It was the product of years of training under conditions that punished hesitation and rewarded clarity. Nielsen was 30 years old during production, and Forbidden Planet represented his most significant film role to that point. Number 17. The intellectual architecture of Forbidden Planet rests heavily on the theories of Sigmund Freud, particularly the concept of the ID as the primitive, uncontrolled layer of the human psyche. Dr. Morbius, without fully understanding what he has done, uses the Krell's ancient mental amplification technology to give his own unconscious desires and jealousies physical form. Playing this character required more than conventional dramatic preparation. Walter Pidgeon reportedly spent time studying Freudian theory before and during production, consulting written materials on psychoanalytic concepts so that his portrayal of Morbius would carry genuine intellectual weight. The goal was not to deliver a lecture, but to inhabit a man who genuinely believed himself to be reasonable and controlled, while being utterly blind to the catastrophic force his own subconscious had unleashed. Pidgeon's performance succeeds precisely because Morbius never reads as a villain. He reads as a brilliant man destroyed by the one thing he failed to examine: himself. Number 16. And Frances actively participated in discussions about how Altera's physical presentation should reflect her character's history. A young woman who had grown up entirely on an alien planet, with no contact with Earth culture or social convention, would not have the same relationship to clothing, shoes, or personal presentation that an Earth-raised person would. Frances argued for details that would reinforce Altera's genuine otherworldliness, rather than simply making her look like a Hollywood starlet transplanted to a studio set. One result of that thinking was the recurring visual detail of Altera being frequently seen barefoot or in minimal footwear, moving through the alien landscape of Altair with a naturalness that contrasted sharply with the uniformed, boot-wearing crew of the C-57D. It remains one of the small, authentic touches that gives the character a consistency missing from many science fiction heroines of the era. Number 15. Warren Stevens, who played Dr. Ostro, the ship's medical officer aboard the C-57D, brought a background that informed his portrayal in ways not immediately visible on screen. Stevens had served in the United States Army during the Second World War before turning to acting, and the experience of military hierarchy, the specific dynamics between officers of different ranks and specializations, shaped how he approached the ensemble work that Forbidden Planet required. Dr. Ostro is not a leading role, but Stevens understood that the credibility of the crew as a functioning military unit depended on every performer playing their position with genuine conviction. His chemistry with Leslie Nielsen, which mirrors the later dynamic between Kirk and McCoy in Star Trek to a remarkable degree, came from a shared understanding of how professional men under pressure relate to one another. Stevens later acknowledged that Forbidden Planet remained one of the productions he was most proud of, despite the relatively modest scale of his part. Number 14. Jack Kelly, who played Lieutenant Farman in Forbidden Planet, was during this same period establishing himself as a television presence through work that would eventually lead to his long-running role in the Western series Maverick, which debuted in 1957. The 1950s represented a peculiar moment in Hollywood history when the boundaries between film and television were being actively contested, and many performers moved between both mediums simultaneously. Kelly's participation in Forbidden Planet was therefore part of a broader career strategy that recognized both film and television as legitimate arenas. His performance as Farman, a crew member whose interest in Altera creates friction with the ship's command structure, is efficiently charming, the work of a performer who understood how to make an impression in limited screen time. The ease he projects would become his television trademark in the years immediately following. Number 13. Earl Holliman played the ship's cook, a character whose primary contribution to the film is comic relief and a memorable subplot involving Robbie the robot's ability to synthesize any substance, including bourbon. The character was nearly eliminated during the script development process. Studio executives debated whether a comic figure belonged in a production that was aiming for a more serious and ambitious tone than the typical science fiction fare of the era. The argument in favor of keeping the cook was ultimately practical as well as artistic. Forbidden Planet was asking its audience to accept an enormous amount of unfamiliar material, from alien planets to invisible monsters to Freudian psychology rendered in science-fictional terms. A character who responded to these extraordinary circumstances with recognizable human appetites and humor provided an emotional anchor for audience members who might otherwise feel distanced from the film's more abstract concerns. Holliman embraced the role fully and delivered some of the film's most genuinely funny moments. Number 12. Richard Anderson appeared in Forbidden Planet as Lieutenant Quinn, a crew member whose fate in the film is decidedly unpleasant. Anderson was in his late 20s during production and was still building the resume that would define his career. What most fans of Forbidden Planet do not know is that Anderson went on to become one of the most recognizable faces in science fiction television during the 1970s, playing Oscar Goldman across both The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman. His long association with the science fiction genre therefore began in a meaningful way with Forbidden Planet, though the connection is rarely drawn. Anderson later reflected that working on the film gave him an early understanding of how science fiction storytelling differed from conventional drama, particularly in the way it required performers to treat impossible circumstances with complete behavioral authenticity. Number 11. One of the emotional cores of Forbidden Planet is the relationship between Dr. Morbius and his daughter Altera, a bond that is simultaneously genuine and deeply compromised by Morbius's unconscious possessiveness. Walter Pidgeon was 58 years old during production, and Francis was 24. The age gap was appropriate for the characters, but translating that gap into a believable familial warmth, while also conveying the subtle wrongness beneath the surface, required careful work. Both performers later spoke about the rehearsal process they undertook together before cameras rolled, working to build a sense of shared history and mutual familiarity that would read as authentic even in scenes that were deliberately unsettling. The result is one of the more psychologically complex parent-child relationships in 1950s Hollywood cinema, one that operates on a normal surface level while allowing attentive viewers to sense the darker currents running beneath. Number 10. Commander Adams's romantic pursuit of Altera provides the film's emotional through line alongside the central horror of the ID monster. Leslie Nielsen was not entirely at ease with how this subplot was written or how it required him to behave toward a character who was, within the fiction, a woman with essentially no experience of the world outside her father's compound. Nielsen was a serious performer who thought carefully about the characters he played, and he found aspects of Adams's persistence in pursuing Altera, despite her clear inexperience, to be worth questioning. He raised these concerns during production, contributing to minor adjustments in how certain scenes were played. The final film handles the romance more thoughtfully than the original draft apparently did, in part because Nielsen pushed back against a version of Adams that he felt read as more predatory than heroic. Number 9. While Robbie the Robot is not a human cast member in the conventional sense, the performances that brought him to life deserve recognition as genuine acting work. The robot required two people to operate during filming. Frankie Darro, a former child actor who had worked in Hollywood since the silent era, wore the robot costume and physically inhabited the character, providing Robbie's movements and gestures. Marvin Miller provided the voice, recording the robot's distinctive dialogue and vocal performances separately. The challenge of coordinating these two performances, ensuring that the physical movements matched the vocal rhythms and that the character felt like a unified presence rather than a technical assembly, required rehearsal and communication between the two performers and the director. Miller's voice gave Robbie a dry, civilized intelligence that became central to the character's appeal, while Darrow's physical work gave the robot a surprising degree of expressiveness despite the rigid costume. Number 8. Of all the performers in Forbidden Planet, and Francis maintained the most consistent and personally meaningful connection to the film across the decades that followed its release. Walter Pidgeon moved on to other dramatic work. Leslie Nielsen eventually reinvented himself entirely as a comic performer in the Airplane and Naked Gun franchises, putting considerable distance between himself and his earlier dramatic roles. And Francis, by contrast, embraced the film's legacy and the affection of science fiction fans with genuine warmth. She attended conventions and fan events related to the film well into her later years, speaking thoughtfully about what the production had meant to her and what she believed it had contributed to the genre. When she passed away in 2011, tributes from the science fiction community reflected a genuine sense of personal loss, not merely the recognition of a professional milestone. Number 7. The casting process for Forbidden Planet involved considerable flexibility in how roles were assigned. Warren Stevens, who eventually played Dr. Ostro, initially read for the role of Commander Adams before the production team determined that Leslie Nielsen's particular combination of authority and accessible warmth better suited the leading role. This kind of shifting during the casting process was not unusual for MGM productions of the period, where the studio system still maintained enough control over contract players to move performers between roles as the creative vision clarified. Stevens took no apparent offense at being redirected toward the supporting role and delivered a performance that, in its quiet competence, arguably makes the crew feel more real than it would have with a more obviously cast ensemble. Number 6. Director Fred M. Wilcox made an unusual decision early in the production process. Before principal photography began, he organized a session in which the cast was given an overview of the Freudian concepts that underpinned the film's story. The idea was not to turn the actors into amateur psychologists, but to ensure that everyone involved understood the thematic framework they were operating within. A cast that grasped the significance of the idea and understood that the monster terrorizing the story was not an external threat, but a projection of one character's unconscious mind, would make different and better choices than a cast working solely from the surface of the script. By several accounts, this session was genuinely illuminating for the performers and contributed to the unusual psychological coherence of the film. Characters behave consistently not because the script forced them to, but because the actors understood what they were dramatizing. Number 5. Leslie Nielsen was born and raised in Canada, in a small town in the Northwest Territories, where his father served as a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer. The background was about as far from the American naval military culture that Commander Adams was meant to embody as it was possible to get. Nielsen worked carefully on the vocal and behavioral elements that would make Adams read as a specifically American military commander rather than the generically authoritative figure. The distinction mattered because Forbidden Planet was in many ways a film about American institutional confidence, the idea that human beings equipped with the right technology and the right command structure could navigate even the most alien circumstances. Adams needed to embody that confidence convincingly, and Nielsen's careful preparation ensured that the character's Americanness was never in doubt, despite the actor behind it being neither American nor from a military family. Number 4. A review of the film's structure reveals something that is easy to overlook during viewing, but becomes striking upon reflection. Altera appears in every scene set on the surface of Altair, for that involves human characters. She is the constant of the planet's landscape, the figure through whom the audience understands this alien world and its relationship to the human beings who have arrived in it. This was a deliberate structural choice by the filmmakers, but it placed an unusual burden on and Francis to sustain audience engagement across the full length of the film. Most supporting and leading performers in ensemble productions have scenes in which they are absent, giving them natural rest periods within the shooting schedule. Francis had no such relief. Her sustained presence required a consistency of characterization and energy that she maintained throughout, contributing to the film's sense of Altera as genuinely the emotional center of the story rather than a peripheral figure. Number 3. Walter Pidgeon had played heroes, villains, romantic leads, and authority figures across a career stretching back to the silent era. He had worked with some of Hollywood's greatest directors and, opposite, some of its most celebrated performers. By his own account, however, he found the demands of Dr. Morbius among the most challenging he had encountered, not because of the physical requirements of the role, but because of its psychological complexity. Playing a man who is simultaneously sympathetic and catastrophically dangerous, who loves his daughter genuinely, while his unconscious mind works to destroy anyone who might take her away, required a kind of constant double awareness that Pidgeon found genuinely taxing. He later described the role as one he continued thinking about long after production ended, which he considered a mark of its depth. For a performer who had spent decades moving efficiently from one assignment to the next, that kind of lingering engagement was itself remarkable. Number 2. The connections between Forbidden Planet and Star Trek run deeper than most casual observers realize, and those connections extend directly to the cast. When Gene Roddenberry was developing Star Trek in the mid-1960s, casting discussions for the early pilots included serious consideration of multiple Forbidden Planet alumni. Leslie Nielsen was among those whose name appeared in connection with the command role that eventually went to Jeffrey Hunter in the unaired pilot, and then to William Shatner in the series proper. And Francis was considered for a significant female role. Warren Stevens was among the dramatic actors whose work in the 1956 film had demonstrated the ability to handle science fiction material with the seriousness Roddenberry wanted. None of these castings ultimately occurred, but the fact that Roddenberry and his team were drawing directly from the Forbidden Planet ensemble when imagining what Star Trek might look like, confirms the extent to which the earlier film served as a template for the later series. Number 1. When historians write about the significance of Forbidden Planet, they tend to focus on the production design, the electronic score, the Shakespeare adaptation, and the philosophical ambition. What receives less attention is the contribution of the performers themselves to the film's lasting impact. Walter Pidgeon and Francis, Leslie Nielsen, Warren Stevens, and their colleagues demonstrated something in 1956 that had not been clearly demonstrated before. That science fiction material could support genuine dramatic acting, that performers of real talent could engage with the genre's ideas seriously and produce work of lasting emotional resonance. Before Forbidden Planet, science fiction cinema was largely considered beneath the serious actor's attention. The film changed that perception, not just through its production values, but through the quality of the performances at its center. Every actor who has since brought dignity and craft to science fiction work, from the cast of the original Star Trek through the performers who have inhabited superhero films and space operas across the decades, owes something to the ensemble that gathered on an MGM soundstage in 1955 and took the genre seriously before the genre had earned that respect. That may be the cast of Forbidden Planet's most significant and least celebrated achievement. Forbidden Planet endures not merely as a technical landmark or a philosophical curiosity, but as a testament to what happens when talented people commit fully to material that asks more of them than convention requires. The cast gave the film its soul, and that soul has been circulating through science fiction ever since.